this. The session is entitled Issues and Challenges with the Beef Supply Chain. Obviously, I'm not Bart Fisher again. He's not wasn't able to be here, and I'm going to moderate this, which everything's kind of been changed up. The initial program presentation schedule was going to be David, then Justin Benavides was going to talk about some of the research that he was worked on that we did for Congress. He went back and is handling something tomorrow that David is going to miss, and so we're going to skip that one, and then Charlie's going to finish it up, so we'll be done relatively early unless he filibusters. But to start with, this whole project, if you don't know, obviously the livestock pricing has been an issue. Congress has been involved. That's what got our center involved. They have asked us on 3 separate occasions to do analyses on different aspects of livestock pricing. This industry is a small group of people that work on this full time, but we have done 3 different studies. The first one was a book that was had everybody from the South that works on livestock, and from some from not from the South as well, from across the nation actually, that work on livestock to work on that book. The big deal is about David knows it better than I do, but the issue that people were concerned about was margins during the fire, after the fire, the packing plant fire, then during the COVID. Margins kind of ran off on everybody, and livestock producers, cow-calf folks were complaining. So they've found some sympathetic senators who have worked on some legislation to reduce the amount of formula trading and increase the amount of cash trades. And that will have differing repercussions across different regions that relied on different, Texas, Oklahoma has historically been very heavy in formula and less on cash transactions, and that will, if their legislation goes through, that will mandate more cash in that. And from the economics work that we had worked on, all of us worked on this book, I think the one resounding thing that people would talk about is the industry does what they do for efficiencies, and if you increase the amount of cash, if you mandate that they have to have more cash transactions, then likely the transaction costs are going to go up, and somebody's going to have to pay those costs. And anytime I talk to producers, I tell them, get ready, because it's usually you. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Well, maybe. Hey, Tori, you remember we do we share it first? We got to share the screen first.
Share.
Share. Suppose we're sharing.
No, you'll need to stop the share there.
I just started it.
Then, where's your PowerPoint at?
Right there.
Click on your PowerPoint. Open it up.
So there we go.
Now go back to Zoom. Minimize that. Now share screen.
Oh.
Click on whichever one.
Oh, okay. We're gonna do this a different way. Okay. Cool. Thanks. That's a different order than I would have done it. Probably nobody would have seen it if I'd have done it. Okay. What I thought we'd do as we talked about this program is to do some slides that we did with some staff members last week, and staff, House Ag Committee staff, kind of moving beyond a little bit the mandating formula or mandating cash trade and what level of cash trade we're going to do. But let's go forward a little bit and think about this in terms of the policy supporting expanding packing capacity. the things we're doing to expand packing plants and support the startup of new ones, not only small ones and local plants, but big plants that are not part of the current big four, whether they're producer-owned co-ops or whatever. But there's some things in the marketplace that I think are important, have some pretty important implications for how that's going to play out over the next few years. So our point of doing this with the staff last, what they asked was for sort of an update of what's going on in the market and what might we expect, and how does this affect some of these things we're working on. So that's the direction we sort of took this. And you know, where I started with this is we can't escape this, which is the drought. And so if we're thinking about some overriding issues affecting cattle numbers, we're rapidly reducing the number of cows in the US, really started by drought. And so if we're going to add capacity, we're adding capacity in the face of declining numbers. And and I think this is where it fits together pretty good with some of Charlie's work is on capacity and things like that. However we measure capacity, we're declining in numbers. And we have head that go through a plant, but meat that comes out the other end. And so we really face this capacity thing in terms of the number of head that we have available. So we've got this going on that's working to drive down cattle numbers. We've also got high feed costs that gives us, I think, the second most important reason for fewer cattle numbers, and that is an economic reason of calf prices that have not, while they're higher, they have not increased as fast as input costs have. And whether we use fertilizer for everywhere from I-35 to the east where we have improved pastures, or fuel costs or whatever else, we have, I think the second most important reason is rising costs. So if we think about this in terms of herd reduction, and we think about just very simply in a cow inventory, we're declining the number of cows. We've got fewer of them. We've been declining for a couple of years in terms of a cycle concept. We've got the lows in those beef cow numbers following the drought. And we're rapidly getting to numbers that are going to rival the drought in terms of how few cows we're going to have in the US. And so what I've tried to convey is just how many cows we're actually killing every week. And we've got 4 weeks this year that are over 80,000 head, which is the largest weekly kill in a decade. We've got, these are slaughter numbers that we ought to see in the fall of a year, not in the spring and early summer. And so not only are we sending more of them to market, but we're holding back fewer replacements. So the number of heifer in the July cattle inventory report, which a week ago Friday, just over 4 million replacement heifers were reported. That's the smallest number ever in the data. So if we go back to 1973, when the July inventory report started, this is the fewest number of heifers held back for beef cow replacement in the data. So not only are we killing the cows, we're not holding back the heifers either. So the implication is that we're going to have rapidly declining cattle numbers, fewer cows, fewer calves. And if we compare that up with expanding building new packing plants, in theory, they're going to open at historically low cattle numbers. So how are they going to survive? And I go back to a newspaper article I have back at the office, and the headline is something like, "Whatever you do, don't build a packing plant." And what happens in cattle every time is margins are large, as measured by the live to cutout spread. And so, boy, that's profitable. So let's build a plant. By the time the plant gets built, those aren't record margins anymore, because we've shrunk the cow herd and cattle prices have gone up, and that margin is no longer there. And so, I think there's a policy implication here that we're going to build a bunch of plants. If all of them get built, that there will be there's not going to be any cattle to operate those plants. So it's pretty easy to come up with planned capacity, daily average kill of these plants that are planned of over 16,000 head a day. 8,000 of those are in one plant planned in western South Dakota. 8,000 head a day. And so it's pretty easy to see, I think, planned expansion hitting the reality of nothing for them to do once they get there. Now, they say in their press release, they say they're going to also process buffalo and they can kill all the buffalo. They can finish the job of the guys in the 1800s quite quickly with a 8,000 head per day plant. So, you know, the idea of more plants really, I think, hits some pretty serious reality. I thought I would also point out, because remember, when we're doing this, we're doing it with folks who they aren't keeping up with market type stuff all the time. They got a busy job. But if we think about beef production, I think it's a surprise for folks to realize that last year we had record large beef production, the most beef production on record, over 28 billion pounds. So when we talk about all these issues with supply chain problems and capacity and how did we get through all of this, we actually have record beef production. And that turns out to be a real surprise to a lot of people. I get a lot of questions because they don't expect that given all the pandemic turmoil. So, you know, we would certainly expect, and I just kind of typed in my own kind of numbers for 22 and 23 in terms of my expectations of commercial beef production, but declining cattle numbers and declining production on the beef side. So the total amount of volume that's going to be available for new plants, which the policy is sort of to help these new plants get started, is going to run into a pretty, I think, a rough road ahead. So just to also point out a couple of things in terms of prices that we used with folks last week is that if we look at some of these, just a simple look at annual average cattle prices for calves, feeder cattle, and fed cattle, my own expectation is we're going to end up with fewer cows and fewer cattle than we did following the last drought of a decade ago. So my expectation is in the next couple of years, we're going to have prices in excess of the records of 14 and 15, just based on fewer cattle, tighter supplies. And so it's going to be, that is a tough economic climate for a packing plant, particularly a brand new startup, to survive in. So, you know, I just think this is where kind of some of these planned capacity expansion is going to hit reality here. I did share a couple of things with them, just calf prices, to point out that even though we have drought, we have high feed costs. Let me jump to this next one. Feeder cattle prices are shooting through the roof with, you know, extremely high feed costs. Well, why? Well, feedlot closeouts have been profitable. Feeders have been making money. The expectation on the futures market is for higher cattle prices, fed cattle prices. And so the expectation is of profits too. And so we're, even in the face of high feed costs and a lot more cattle coming to market, feeder cattle prices are going up pretty rapidly. So anyway, I think, you know, in some of sharing some of these basic ideas and thinking about the implications of expanded capacity going forward, I think it's pretty important to kind of think about these basic numbers. So that really, you know, well, let me show a couple more just because I did it with them. The cutout value, because we get these questions about the live to cutout spread as an indicator of packer profits, or gross margin idea. And in a broader picture, anyway, if we think about the cutout value being the wholesale value, it's interesting to note that we've actually had wholesale values not only below last year's level, but below the 5-year average. I think that surprises people too, because we see, you know, whether it's the CPI or measures of inflation and beef prices and meat prices going up at the wholesale level, they've moderated pretty dramatically compared to last year. And that seems to be a surprise to a lot of people. They don't expect that, particularly when you put that together with retail beef prices that are, while they're below last October, which was a record high, they really haven't come down at all. And so we think about this spread, or if we were interested in the margin from the wholesale to retail, which implies the meat case margin, that thing is huge historically. And so we've gone from this idea of live to cutout with Packers making all the money. The grocery store meat case is a pretty interesting area. One of the things I find interesting from more of a research standpoint is why don't we see retail prices, given this long time lag, adjust a little more to the wholesale level? Because I think if we looked at some past research, we would have expected a little more adjustment. And I know we have higher costs of getting it to the store, everything associated with that. But I find that to be kind of interesting. I think that's an area where there could be some good, more analysis, more analytical work on that. And the time of have our time lags that we see in the word escapes me, but the time like, what's that? Yeah, the stuff. Yeah. Shit. Damn it, the price transmission from wholesale to retail is pretty interesting to me. I would have expected, based on past work, we would have seen some more adjustment than we've seen so far, and we really haven't. And so anyway, in terms of policy implications with this idea of expanding capacity is certainly one in the face of declining cattle inventory. And we could certainly talk about cost competitiveness of new small plants with large established plants. We know there's huge economies of scale in meat packing. And that's one of the problems with some of these plants, that they're right away, they're behind the 8 ball on costs. And then they're going to have to compete for supplies. So that's my last slide. We really just wanted to highlight this idea of declining cattle numbers and what it means for capacity. So that is my last slide. So let's see here. I can stop sharing that, or do you want me to leave it on? Stop sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, he should be able to share.
Oh shit, did I turn it off? No, thank God. I thought I had turned it off. Charlie, you ought to be able to share.
Am I good?
Well, I don't know I'd go that far, but we can see you. We can't see your slides though. We're getting professional help. Oh, here we go.
Sorry.
We're almost there. Hold on just a second. Oh. How'd you know that?
I've helped a lot of people through this conference.
Are we good?
We're good.
I'll just say it's because Tori's she's a UT employee. That's why. So as I don't know who's all there. I'm just talking to a blank wall. So hopefully it all makes sense at the end of the day. But I'm Charlie Martinez. I'm back home in Tennessee. And so right now it is technically 8:04 p.m. So good evening from the East Coast, but good afternoon to y'all. And you know, Dr. Anderson kind of highlighted some certain things, and we're going to talk about a little bit of that stuff when it comes to the packing capacity and the dynamics in the beef sector. And some of this is going to come off of a project that myself, Dr. Chris Boyer, my grad student Seth Ingram, and Dr. Josh Maples and I are all working on. And from there, you know, recently there's been a lot of questions when it comes to capacity. Specifically, there's been a quote. You know, there's an old saying that goes down, or like a commercial that happens in North Texas that says, you know, we need more this and we need it now. And so from that standpoint, in a global, or I guess an industry dynamic, it's we need more capacity and we need it now. And so from that standpoint for us, you know, here, it's if it's not fed cattle cash sales, then it's capacity. We think of it as a coin in terms of research, in terms of, if we're not talking about fed cattle cash sales, then we're talking about capacity. And so from there, you know, we've all seen the highlights from media, and I've got some examples there. You know, it's President Joe Biden talking about it. We have the Grassley bill. Anderson, we're good?
Keep going. We gotta
Keep
turn-
talking.
They said they're loud.
That's either good or bad. So we have a lot of stuff happening in terms of competition, price transparency. We have a lot of stuff on supply chain issues, and there's been a lot of money put into this supply chain resiliency. Do I keep talking? I see a bunch of people in the camera now.
Keep talking. You're fine, Charlie.
Oh,
We're trying
okay.
to turn the volume down just a little bit.
Oh, hey, I can talk quieter like this. But so we have a lot of issues happening from a popularity standpoint when it comes to the media attention towards capacity. And so if we think about capacity, though, the first question always comes out, where is our current capacity at? And what you're looking at here is cattle processing plants and the distribution of cattle on feed. If you look for these pink dots here, that's basically where more than 3,000 head are slaughtered per day at a plant. And then the pink dots are where our cattle on feed are for the most part. And so you can see out through the southern plains, up through Oklahoma, Nebraska, Iowa, all, in that region, that's where a lot of our cattle on feed are. And so, if we think efficiency and think of things of that nature, that's where we would naturally see our packing plants. It's where our cattle on feed are. Well, our cattle on feed are there because of efficiency, because of the production of grain and stuff that is used to produce feed for the animals. And so we logically see that, and it's not as I guess, for lack of a better term, so bottlenecked compared to other industries like pork and poultry. It's kind of actually spread out. We even have some here in Pennsylvania that actually are bigger plants. We have some in the Northeast or the Northwest. And so we even have some in here in California. And so from that perspective, we do have a wide net of where our packing plants are, but still, if you look in the Southeast, for instance, there's not a lot of large packing plants there. And so it induces this conversation of, do we need to expand capacity? Do we need to expand the ability of the supply chain to reach certain regions? And we'll say, quote unquote, local regions or local markets. And so that's stuff that from a research perspective, we've been trying to battle here in the last couple of, I guess, basically since the COVID pandemic. That's the stuff we've been interested in. If we leave and spread that over where the cow-calf sector is, you can see we have a large net in a widespread net of where our cow-calf producers are in these blue dots versus what I just showed you in the cattle on feed and also these packing plants. And so I use the Southeast just because that's where I'm at. But in the Southeast, we don't have a lot of packing plants here. Is that good or bad? Is that beneficial to the supply chain or not? Do we need to increase that capacity? These are the questions that we've been hearing for the last couple of years. And so that's what we want to try to tackle and understand better before we start inducing a lot of policy relative to the fact that there's been roughly $1 billion put into the Rural Development Fund in order to develop more local and regional capacity. I feel bad if Dr. Dale Peel is in the crowd. I feel bad because I always, throw this chart up recently and kind of say it's him and CattleFax, but people often rely on this chart that you're looking at, and it's a picture, and that's why it's kind of fuzzy. But CattleFax often throws this figure out that says, hey, we had enough capacity from 2005 all the way to 2015, and then it kind of dips down, and we had excess or not enough capacity in 2016 all the way down into 2019. And I grew up as a cow-calf kid and stuff from that. When I look back, I often thought of CattleFax. I worked in the feed yards, and we would often see CattleFax, and we took that as that is what's happening in the industry. They get a lot of voluntary data, and that's what we assume is correct. But what if we start thinking about it differently and say, hey, let's look at the literature, let's look at the rest of the industry. Can we estimate our own basically capacity or excess capacity number, or from an annual perspective, and see if they're correct, or is there different trends or anything of that nature? And that's kind of where in our big project we started thinking, okay, let's see if we can do that, and let's look at the dynamics with the beef industry. And so from that standpoint, obviously the first thing is that we have to understand what is the max capacity from a national perspective. And I say operational capacity because just because Joe Outlaw or David Anderson can run 100 miles an hour, and I'll give them some credit for running 100 miles an hour, doesn't mean they want to do that at all times. They might say, I want to run at 50 miles an hour just because that's what makes us efficient. And so there becomes a question of what is operational or efficient capacity versus the max capacity. And so if we can estimate a max number and an operational number, then we can look at, is there excess or not excess capacity in the sector. And so we have, from that perspective, we relied on landmarks, and I'll say that in air quotes because we wanted to go back in literature, try to find landmarks that said, hey, here's what the capacity is nationally, and can we find another landmark and then fill in the gaps in between. And so from that perspective, we also have to take out closures over time if the gap is wide enough. And what I mean by closures is plants that come offline, like a Cargill in 2013. When they came offline, could we estimate the difference in the capacity over time? And so what we decided was 2000, and I'll show you here in a minute why we picked 2000. And then we also picked 2020, and I'll show you here in a minute why. But we have two landmarks. So we think point A, point B, we have 20 years of difference. And then if we adjust for plant removal, and then we also adjust for total annual slaughter days, that we could estimate an actual number there. And so I call this the buildup because this is how we have to start estimating it. So in 2000, all the way to 2020, we found one landmark. Our first landmark was, or we found two landmarks. The first one was Clem Ward and one of his grad students, Jonathan Hornung. They estimated that total head of fed cattle, keep in mind I say fed cattle, was a little over 29 million annually. And then over time from 2000 all the way to 2020, we lost three different plants. We lost in 2001, we lost the Conagra plant in Garden City, which was estimated to harvest 4,000 head a day. In 2008, we lost Tyson in Emporia, and that was estimated to harvest 4,000 head a day. And in 2013, we lost Cargill in Plainview, Texas, which was estimated to have 4,650 head per day. So it's like, okay, if we have one landmark, we take out our big three. In 2020, there was a study that came out from Jason Lusk and Maylene Ma that said, hey, we harvest 26 million, a little over 26 million head a year in total slaughter capacity. Keep in mind, I said total slaughter capacity. And so that basically estimate, or 26 million, sorry, fed cattle capacity versus 33 million head of total FI slaughter. And so let me make sure everyone's keeping up with me because I'm throwing a lot of numbers at folks. If we start in 2000, there's 29.3 million head of fed slaughter cattle, fed being fed slaughter steer, fed slaughter heifer. And then in 2000, Jason Lusk and Maylene Ma estimated there's 26 million, a little over 26 million of fed slaughter steer heifers out of a total of a 33 million total FI slaughter or federally inspected slaughter. We know that approximately over that time, 80% of all FI slaughter is going to be fed cattle. And so if we take this 33 million head number and we approximate 80%, we can see if that is accurate or not. And so if we take that number and we divide 26, a little over 26 million divided by 33 million, we end up at 78.7%. And so if we think back, this number here, this 80% FI slaughter of fed cattle, we actually have roughly 79, give or less, 1% total fed cattle slaughter. And so if we, from that standpoint, we were pretty excited because if we build up from 2000 all the way to 2020, and we take our landmarks of Clem Ward and Jonathan Hornung, and we look at all the way to Maylene Ma and Jason Lusk, we actually end up right on point with almost approximately 80% of FI slaughter in the fed cattle industry. And so for us, it says, okay, we have our point A, we have our point B, we take out those 3 big plants that happen, we actually end up with approximately the same number that we would expect. And for us, it's saying for us, we thought, okay, we actually have a continuous time series that we're looking for to estimate this max capacity. Keep in mind, I'm talking about max capacity, not utilization. And so from that perspective, if we take that number, we actually find that we actually have excess capacity, all except for 2019. We're actually down 0.2%. And so if we think about it, from 05, we had 6.1% excess capacity. We kind of came down in 2008, and we ramped up in 2015 to 13% and came back down. What does that look like compared to that figure I threw up in front of you at the beginning from CattleFax, and I feel bad, but Daryl Peel? We actually have the same trend. We were high in 2005, came down in 2008, popped up in 2015, and then came back down. And then we rose up in 2020. So from the CattleFax number, we're actually finding that the only excess capacity number that we find that we didn't have enough was in 2019, which also coincides with the fact that they thought that in 2019 it was the lowest number nationally from an aggregate standpoint. And that's one thing I also want to highlight. This is aggregate. We don't know regional impacts, but we know from an aggregate perspective that in 2019 it was the lowest number in terms of we didn't have enough capacity. So what does that look like when we start thinking about cattle on feed? Dr. Anderson talked about it. If we overlay cattle on feed, you see here in 2014 all the way to 2017, that's when we see this excess capacity. And so we start thinking about this cattle cycle that Dr. Anderson is talking about. When we start bringing a less calves into the feed yard, and we have low numbers of cattle on feed, that's when we see this high number of excess capacity, and specifically in 2014 all the way up through 2017. And so for us, it was kind of interesting that when we overlay this, the question becomes, well, in 2015 we had 13%, then we dropped down, even though this cattle on feed number really didn't change. What does that really mean? And keep in mind that we're estimating currently that there's 101.7 thousand head a day that we can slaughter currently. If we think about this number, all the way down from 13% all the way down to 7.2%, keep in mind that this cattle on feed number did not change by that much. What happened? We have access to a database that shows a self-reported mixture, and I'll call it a mixture, of how do packing plants aggregate or allocate their chain capacity to fed cattle versus bulls and cows, and we'll call it the cull cow market. And one of the big four, and we'll call it the big four, they adjusted from 90% to 80% capacity in terms of, when I say that, which means basically that one of the big four said, hey, we're going to allocate 90% of our chains to fed capacity. We're actually going to change that down to 80%, and we're going to put the other 10% towards bulls and cows. And so this drastic change here happened because one of the big four decided to reallocate their chains to a certain segment. And so it wasn't, while the cattle on feed did not change, relatively speaking, this big drop actually happened because of one of the packers saying, hey, we have excess capacity, let's reallocate. And so so then the next question is, logically, what does all this mean? Because I'm picking on the CattleFax number, and I'm saying that it doesn't incorporate certain things. And when I say certain things, it only allocates 40 hours a day or 40 hours in a week. We know that there's Saturday slaughter that occurs. And this is what you're looking at here is actually the operational capacity of, from an aggregate level, of the national beef sector. And so you see here, we have some spikes, we have some draws, we have some spikes, we have some draws. But what you're looking at is basically there are times where our packing plants are above 50% national capacity or operational capacity on a given Saturday. And some of these are dependent upon a one of the what we call major holidays like a July 4th or a Christmas, and we see some spikes here. But as we get past 2016, we're actually, if you draw a line here, we're above 40%. And so what we see here is that this absorption day or the absorption day or catch-up day that Saturday is often referred to, we're seeing that packing plants are trying to allocate more time to Saturday relative to their weekly capacity. And so if we look at weekly capacity, we see that weekly capacity trended downwards in 2016 and then essentially has held stable since then. So if we look back, we see a pickup in 2016 and it holds stable. We go downwards in 2016 and it holds stable. And so people, these plants, to us, it signals that it seems to us that they're actually using Saturday to their advantage. And when I say that, it means if they have a lot amount of labor, they have a lot amount of resources, they're trying to allocate it steadily to Saturday, as we see the peak in Saturday and a steady trend in the weekly or the weekly slaughter that we're seeing from an operational capacity. And so for us, it says, you know, if we see these trends and we've identified a number that we feel confident in, what does that mean moving forward? And so we know that previous research has suggested that price responses are dependent upon this processing capacity or operational capacity, but we also know that it's likely nonlinear in the nature of this number. And if it's that way, then we know from a research perspective or an econometric perspective that we have regimes that are sitting inside this operational capacity. And so for us, we're trying to say, can we identify these relationships with a cash trade? Because it's so highly publicized right now from a policy and a media perspective. Can we identify those trends? That's our next question. We've done that in preliminary results. We find that there's actually two regimes in weekly slaughter. And what I mean by that is that we have identified when weekly slaughter accurately goes over a certain percentage of operational capacity, we're actually finding that there is different relationships between cash trade and slaughter capacity. And that we're also finding that there's impacts depending upon the regime. And we're actually finding that there's little evidence of those changes between regimes. In other words, there's changes between operational capacity has little impact on prices. And so for us, that opens up a box where we've never really looked at that before from a research perspective. And so when Dr. Anderson mentions, hey, what happens when cattle on feed goes down because of a natural cattle cycle, and we open up all these new plants and we have excess capacity, what does that mean for our prices? And that's what we're trying to look at. So from where we're headed, we're using a threshold vector autoregression type of method. We've identified that 88% is where we've identified in terms of the weekly capacity is, which means basically that if you're below 88% or above 88%, those interactions between capacity utilization and prices, we're finding different interactions. And then if we think about Saturday operational capacity, we're actually finding if we shock Saturday operational capacity because we're using a time series method, we're actually finding that there is some type of relationship that impacts only between utilization, not necessarily between prices. And we've used the summary of the negotiated daily prices all the way from 2000 to 2021. We're looking at only 4 markets from our analysis because Colorado, from a confidentiality standpoint, doesn't report enough prices. And so that's where that's the path we're headed on. And so for us, you know, as we start utilizing this utilization number and this operational capacity number, are there unintentional effects as we do pump more money into the rural development fund that does spread out that regional development of packing, basically packing plants in certain regions, such as us in the Southeast? Are there unintentional effects of that as we do move forward? And so for us, what we're trying to look at is not only do we find cash effects or price effects, but often the next publicized thing is this live cattle to the live cattle spread, which is basically when you bring in one fed animal or one fed steer or heifer, and then you sell it as a or at the wholesale level, we see that there's this natural live to cattle spread. Does utilization have impact on that spread? And that we're using time series methods to understand that. And for us, we're actually finding minimal evidence. And so from a captive supply audience, there's a lot of questions there. So we have unintentional effects. What happens the last time? What happens the next time that this cattle and feed number goes down, which is where we're headed? Just like Dr. Anderson said, what happens when this number, if the last number was 13%, what happens when that number jumps up even more? And then we also want to look at it from a policy perspective and a pork perspective. We're going to do the same techniques to try to estimate the pork slaughter numbers and see what happens there. But if there's any questions, I'll take them now. If not, there's my contact information. If there's any other hard questions, I'll direct those to Tori Marshall. She's sitting in the crowd, and we'll go from there. No questions?